There's a quiet contradiction buried along the storm-lashed coasts of northern Europe that most people never stop to question. Timber that should have rotted centuries ago still holds its shape. Ships that cross brutal seas still carry the fingerprints of the hands that built them. And the unsettling part is this: the people who built them didn't have modern chemistry, synthetic coatings, or industrial tools. They had wood, fire, oil, and time, and somehow they built structures that outlast much of what we create today. That should bother you a little, because it forces a question most modern builders don't want to ask. What if the problem isn't that ancient people lacked technology, but that they understood something we've forgotten? Stay with me. Because once you understand how they treated wood not as a dead material, but as something that lives, breathes, and reacts, you'll start to see why so much of what we build today quietly fails. And more importantly, you'll walk away with principles you can actually use, whether you're building a shelter, maintaining a home, or thinking long-term survival. The real problem begins with how we misunderstand water. Most modern construction treats moisture like an enemy to be sealed out completely. We coat wood in thick layers of varnish, epoxy, or synthetic paint, believing that if water can't get in, the structure will die. But that logic ignores something fundamental. Wood is not inert. It constantly exchanges moisture with the environment. Even when it looks dry, it is absorbing and releasing water vapor from the air. When you trap that process under a rigid, non-breathable coating, you don't stop moisture. You trap it. And once it's trapped, especially in climates with temperature swings, it begins to expand, freeze, and fracture the structure from within. That's why so many modern decks, cabins, and boats decay internally while still looking intact on the outside. The northern builders understood this in a way that feels almost uncomfortable in its simplicity. They didn't try to stop water completely. They controlled how it moved. Instead of sealing wood shut, they created a layered system that allowed moisture to escape as vapor, while preventing liquid water from penetrating deeply. That distinction between vapor and liquid is everything. It's the difference between a structure that survives for decades and one that lasts for centuries. The archaeological record makes this impossible to dismiss. When excavators uncovered the Oseberg ship in Norway, they weren't dealing with dry preservation conditions. The vessel had been buried in dense, waterlogged clay for over 1,000 years. In most cases, that environment destroys organic material completely, yet large portions of the ship's wooden structure remained intact. Chemical analysis revealed exactly what had been done to it. Pine tar had penetrated deep into the grain. Linseed oil had polymerized into a flexible internal layer, and the surface showed signs of controlled charring. Now, these weren't random treatments. They were part of a system. A similar story emerged with the Gokstad ship, where the level of tar saturation was so extensive that it penetrated several millimeters into the wood. That kind of depth isn't achieved by brushing on a surface coating. It requires slow absorption, careful preparation, and an understanding of how wood fibers behave at a microscopic level. And this wasn't limited to ships. Places like Bergen, wooden foundations have remained in wet soil for centuries. In Iceland, early timber frames beneath turf structures still survive in environments that should have destroyed them long ago. The pattern repeats across regions and applications. This wasn't a trick. It was standard practice. To understand why it worked, you have to look closely at the materials themselves. Pine tar, when produced slowly at controlled temperatures, separates into different fractions. The lightest of these is the most important. It behaves almost like a penetrating oil, capable of moving through the tiny capillary structures inside wood. Instead of sitting on the surface, it travels inward, reinforcing the material from within. Modern production methods often miss this entirely. High heat destroys the lighter fractions, leaving behind a thicker substance that behaves more like a surface sealant. That's faster, but it fundamentally changes how the material interacts with wood. The older method required patience, slow extraction, careful application, and time for the material to move through the grain. It wasn't efficient by modern standards, but it was effective in a way that mass production rarely achieves. Then there's the combination of linseed oil and ash. On its own, linseed oil has a remarkable property. It slowly reacts with oxygen, transforming from a liquid into a flexible, solid network within the wood. It doesn't become brittle. It moves with the material as it expands and contracts. When combined with wood ash, something even more interesting happens. Ash introduces an alkaline environment that is hostile to fungi and bacteria. In other words, it doesn't just protect the wood physically. It alters the chemical conditions that allow decay to begin in the first place. This creates a kind of internal defense system. Not a hard shell, but a flexible, breathable barrier that resists biological attack, while still allowing moisture to move. Another step in the process seems almost too simple, but it's backed by modern science. Freshly cut timber was often soaked in water for extended periods. At first glance, that sounds counterintuitive. Why would you expose wood to water if you're trying to protect it from moisture? The answer lies in what that soaking removes. Wood contains sugars and starches that fungi feed on. By submerging the timber, those nutrients are leached out. What's left behind is still structurally strong, but far less attractive to decay organisms. It's not that the wood becomes immune to rot. It becomes uninteresting to the things that cause it. That same soaking process also stabilizes the wood's internal structure. When it later dries, it is less prone to warping and cracking. In survival situations, where structural integrity can determine whether a shelter holds or fails, that kind of stability matters more than most people realize. Then comes the most visually striking step. Controlled charring. A light, even burn transforms the outer surface of the wood into a thin layer of carbon. This isn't about burning the wood for strength. It's about changing its chemistry. Carbon is resistant to moisture, insects, and ultraviolet damage. It forms a protective skin that shields the layers beneath. What makes this particularly effective is how it interacts with the tar and oil applied afterward. The carbon layer locks those substances into place, creating a composite surface that is both durable and flexible. This is not guesswork. Modern testing has shown that charred wood surfaces resist environmental degradation far more effectively than untreated wood, especially when combined with natural oils. But even with all of these treatments, there's another factor that often goes unnoticed: the way the wood is joined together. Rigid construction creates stress. When wood expands and contracts, something has to give. If the joints are fixed and unyielding, the stress fractures the material itself. And once cracks form, moisture finds its way in, and the entire protective system begins to fail. The older approach relied on joinery that allowed movement. Wooden pegs, interlocking joints, and carefully fitted connections created structures that could flex slightly without losing integrity. This flexibility preserved the protective layers and prevented the kind of internal damage that modern rigid systems often experience. There's also a critical detail in the avoidance of metal fasteners. Metal introduces localized moisture accumulation. It draws condensation, creates microenvironments for corrosion, and accelerates decay in the surrounding wood. By relying on wood-to-wood connections, that problem is avoided entirely. When you step back and look at the full system, a pattern emerges. Every element works with the natural behavior of wood, not against it. Moisture is managed, not eliminated. Movement is allowed, not restricted. Protection is layered, not forced into a single solution. And that's where modern approaches often fall short. Synthetic coatings promise durability, but they rely on complete isolation from the environment. The moment that isolation fails, and it always does, the system collapses quickly. Trapped moisture accelerates decay, and the damage spreads from the inside out. Natural systems, on the other hand, are more forgiving. They don't rely on perfection, they adapt. For someone thinking about survival, this isn't just historical curiosity, it's practical knowledge. If you're building or maintaining anything exposed to the elements, the goal shouldn't be absolute waterproofing. It should be controlled permeability, allow the material to breathe, prevent liquid intrusion while letting vapor escape. Simple steps can make a difference. Using penetrating oils instead of surface coatings, allowing wood to acclimate and stabilize before use, avoiding rigid joints in environments with significant humidity changes. Even small choices like how materials are layered or how surfaces are treated can extend the lifespan of a structure dramatically. The deeper lesson goes beyond technique. It's about how you approach materials in general. Whether you're working with wood, fabric, or metal, the question isn't how to dominate the environment. It's how to work within it. The people who figured this out didn't have the luxury of failure. Their structures had to survive real conditions, not controlled environments. And because of that, their solutions were grounded in observation, not assumption. That's why their work still speaks to us today. Not as relics of a primitive past, but as evidence of a level of understanding that we're only beginning to rediscover. If this kind of knowledge matters to you, If you care about building things that last, about understanding the real principles behind survival and durability, then don't let it stay buried in history. Share it, talk about it, and most importantly, apply it. Because the difference between something that lasts 10 years and something that lasts 100 often comes down to a single decision, whether you work with nature or try to outsmart it. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of insight, and share this with someone who still believes modern always means better.